coaches, teachers to know what other sports their athletes play? Like what kind of factor does that have with what you're talking about with high level proprioception and coordination?
Yeah. Here's something I noticed a long time ago with players from different parts of the country. I noticed that players in the colder climates would always have less ankle stabilization or be able to stay in the ground versus a kid from California or Florida because of where they come from. You think that most of your cold weather guys, they're in high boots, so it's like they're in a cast for months out of the year, whereas a kid from California or Florida, they're in barefoot, so they're going to have greater levels of proprioception. So I always notice that kids from those type of climates always move better. So really, you want to think, man, the first thing I'm going to ask a player is I'm going to find out where he's from, because where they're from matters. You're going to see, like, your Florida and your California kids, they play baseball early in life, so there's more skill. Because they play more games, there's more need to win. Because there's more need to win, there's more of a focus on skill versus ability. So a lot of those kids have to take out the catcher's mitt to give pitch number 7 versus a kid from Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, one of those football that's more maybe one sport, multi-sport guys. That really matters. Secondly, I would want to know if their career came down to one pitch, what would that pitch be? Because you think the first thing we've got to realize is, what are we trying to change and why are we trying to change it? Is the risk worth the reward? So you take somebody like a Hendricks, a changeup guy. Obviously, he's not going to be as rotational. He's not going to be as explosive. Why? Because his body has set itself up to throw the changeup. That's what he makes his money on. That's what he believes he's best at. Because he believes he's best at it, he makes his money. That's what he practices the most. Because that pitch rewards that linear pattern, that's why it shows up in the movement. And then you think about your 12-6 curveball guys. Like, those dudes think they can throw that 12-6 at any time, anywhere to get people out. Why? Because they probably threw this at an early age when hitters struggled with anything moving. Because they had a lot of success with it, they threw it more often. Because they threw it more often with success, they started to believe in it. Because they believed in it, they practiced it more. Because they practiced it more, they got better at it. So you think about throwing that pitch over and over, what that would require. A higher arm slot, more stability with the feet. So getting an idea of where they're from, very important. But I think really the cheat here is, man, simply asking your players, hey, if you were working with another player, another pitcher on the staff, you know, what would you stress to him about pitch development? And listen to what they say. What cues do they use? How do they describe it? If you were teaching somebody about pitching mechanics, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would stress are most important? So if you see a guy that's got no hip-shoulder separation, and all of a sudden he's telling the guy, hey, man, you need to stride as far as you can, well, there's why he doesn't have hip-shoulder separation. So it's really important to know the difference in the player and who you're talking to. Question.
Lance, I got a question. My question is so we just looked at the videos of the eyes looking down and everything like that. So you're working with a player, or you are a player that has eyes looking down. What's the correction then to get them off of it? Obviously, the simple correction would be don't look down. But for a lot of people, it's just not a reality. That's not a comfort thing. So where do you go next?
That's a good one, man, because I was the same way. Is that I had to look down. So we've got a rule is that first, does it affect him? Is it a bad thing? Is it a guy that happens to throw a slide? Let me give you an example. There's you'll watch Robert Clemens, you'll watch Justin Grimm. Those guys actually look down, and as they look up, their body follows their eyes, so they actually create a tilt to throw a better curveball because of their eyes. So is it really a problem? Is it a guy that looks down that suddenly goes across his body, but he's a two-seam sinker guy? That may help him. Without realizing it, that would be it. So first, I would kind of weigh, is it really a problem? And if it is a problem, then we have a simple rule: is that you look wherever you want, but as you reach the top of the lift, eyes are going to be straight ahead. But if his feet are everywhere, then so an easy one for that. Picture this, like if you're standing there right now, maybe even step up out of your chair and visualize your whole field of vision is a clock. Straight ahead is right in the center, up is simply lift and hold that for about 2 seconds and move your eyes around and notice how your weight will start to
Oh, so listen to this. Mommy, you're the coach.
Hey, so am I the only one that's getting a shit ton of background noise? Like I can't even fucking understand what you're saying, man.
Yeah, Lance, can you mute all?
Yep, I can look that up. Mute. I think I just muted myself.
I think it's on the right, Lance, with the yeah.
Here. So this. Go to here. I don't know.
That seems a lot better.
I didn't do anything. Does it help?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, good.
That's good, man.
Did I answer that question for you? About the
Yeah.
eye?
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Okay. Another one. Anything else?
Hey, Lance. So that video that you showed of that kid, I actually had been looking at that the last couple days, and I made a comment on Twitter about it. Is that if we're teaching kids to throw hard, which is the intent and what we want, we can't just leave them with that and just say, hey, you just need to throw it hard. Someone forgot to tell that kid that he's not trying to throw hard from 60 feet, 6 inches. He's got a lot of stuff that's got to happen before that athletic movement specific to pitching has got to start. And I think he doesn't understand that.
Yeah, well,
do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a lot of players, and I think too, you've got to realize where a lot of these players are coming from. A lot of these players, as coaches and stuff, they're coming to us with more knowledge. They can repeat anatomical textbooks, all this, but movement is a big problem with a lot of guys. But you got to think that what is most of science and most of social media telling us? It's to drive, it's to push off our legs, it's to do a lot of that. So a lot of those players, it reminds me of this, is the old Hebbian Theory. You guys are familiar with that? What wires together, fires together? And maybe this will kind of help. You guys remember, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember this, when the old typewriter, my mom had this antique one, and when you would type, you'd hit 2 letters together, they both would slam up against the paper. And so with the Hebbian Theory, what that says is what wires together, fires together. So here's a good example of this would be like my little girl is 5'4", she's 5 now. We go down the playground and she goes, hey, I've got to go say bye to my friends. I said, well, how many friends you got? And she goes, you know how they'll have to hold their finger together? You got to think up until this point, how the brain views the hand is it's just used to grasp. So we need to talk about a brain map. That's what we need to talk about. But it's just meant to grasp. So she had no use for these fingers with counting, so she didn't have the coordination. So what I see a lot of times with players, Scott, to answer your question, is that because of our lifestyle, because of what we do, their hips and their quads are viewed as one piece. Because they don't use their glutes, they can't, because they're not aware, they can't use them. Does that make sense to you? I know you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it does. Makes a lot of sense.
Anybody else?
Yeah, so
Hey, man.
Go ahead.
I got a question. Have you seen with since the throwing activity is such a dynamic movement, the guys haven't gotten the first part of it right, but have been athletic enough at the trail end to stabilize with the lead foot and get the action correct and be consistent with it?
Yeah, I'll see that, but I'm always asking at what cost. So I'm always kind of looking at the whole picture there, like cost of stuff. You know, if we can put him on any type of data capture or motion assessment, you know, is it at a higher risk? So it's kind of all of it. But to answer your question, yeah, because you'll see a lot of guys in major league that might not be efficient to start, but they're athletic enough to catch up and connect everything at the end later.
So what do you do with a guy like that? I mean, if you get a guy that's performing like that, how do you? I mean, do you subtly bring in his training program, try to get him to do better than that, or do you leave that athlete alone?
What are you trying to do with him would be my question. You know, what's the goal? What's the end goal? Because that would change the path or the route in which you would take. It's measuring up his stuff, and at what cost would change happen. And so really it's on an individual basis. I mean, I don't think there's any clear cut that if he's doing this, I would absolutely change it, because I've just seen so many crazy things.
Lance, I got a question. When you're talking about the correlation between obviously the eyes and how it affects the feet, right?
Uh-huh.
How much crossover do you see, or correlation is there also to other training environments, like let's say the weight room, right, where you're doing explosive movements? Do you see correlations in other things outside of the mound that also dial into that and can have a positive or negative effect once they reach the mound based on things they've been doing from a training standpoint?
Could you be a little bit more specific? I'm kind of, just to make sure that I know what you're saying.
Well, going off the video that you sent, obviously you're showing how his eyes and where his eyes were going was affecting how his feet were positioning, right? And where some of the pressure points on that were occurring, correct?
Yes.
And so obviously throwing is an explosive movement and getting into an explosive movement. So I guess what I was asking is specifically when a pitcher might be in the weight room, are there scenarios, or have you seen where those same concepts are showing up there too, or how their eyes are working through the course of a movement? It's also affecting, where the weight is on their feet and how their feet are reacting based on their eyes.
That's a great question, and absolutely. And that leads me to another point, is that what you see on the mound is a direct reflection of what they're doing off the mound. You'll watch guys in their quality of practice, and they're just mindless. They're not mindful of where their eyes are, the positioning of their feet. And you know what, I think a lot, I hate to get off topic, but I think a lot of that goes back to that idea of a 10,000 hour rule, that if I just put in enough time, I'm going to grasp this. And we really underestimate that quality trumps quantity whenever we're talking about the nervous system and change. But yeah, absolutely, you'll see that a lot of eyes moving everywhere and just addressing it.
Hey, Lance.
Yeah.
Nunzio, I was wanted to answer Rob's question. Something that I find in the weight room that I deal with a lot is a lot of guys, when they deadlift, you can see when guys deadlift or when they squat, they have a tendency to look up, okay? A lot of times they might have tight neck flexors, and when they look up, it shuts off glute activation, and it makes them not be able to actually turn on those rotators in their lower half. And I think maybe a lot of times guys who have a tendency of not being able to get their ribs down from maybe they have high anxiety, or they've got breathing issues where they're out. It puts them in a state of propulsion a lot of times, and you can even see it when they lift. They have their head up, and when their head goes up, they shut their glutes off. And a lot of those guys are those same guys that I think you're talking. Sometimes it could be a neck issue, or it could be a rib cage issue that's keeping them up, and they can't actually hold that head pattern when they're coming down the mound, which may also shut off glute activation and make them get out of that back leg, not be able to hold down that glute activation. I know just kinesthetically, when you lift your head up and you look up, glute activation shuts off in a lift, and I can't imagine why it wouldn't do that as well when you throw.
Good, really good. Here's something that we use a lot as far as when we're thinking about where to go with the player, just using it as a general blank slate. I want you guys to watch this, and we'll talk about it. But how cool is that? Think about that. Like that's how, without, I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. All right, so with that puppet right there, you got to think that, to me, that's my idea of proprioception. It's knowing where your body parts are, where they're labeled. So guys with higher proprioception are going to be better movers. So let me give you just an example of this here. If you looked at the player, the first thing I think we got to realize is that the brain is involved in this whole process. Sure, there's a feedback loop, but it's the mechanics, man. It's not muscle memory. That's something I think a lot of guys get into, is that it's muscle memory, so that we want drills, we want more drills. But unless I've labeled my parts and I'm aware of my body, it really doesn't matter, because when you think about how it works, like the reason you can do this is simply take your finger and touch your nose without smashing it. Think about what the brain's doing right there. It's guesstimating force, it's guesstimating distance. You can close your eyes, you feel where your nose is. It's because the body is mapped with each section. Now, the body parts that we use more often, they're going to devote to bigger size. So the more imposed demands we create on that, the larger the map grows. So that's why, like, a piano player would have high proprioception in his fingers, a blind person even, but with pitchers, in general, the maps aren't mapped real clearly. So you're going to see a lot of guys that lack hip proprioception because they don't have a good feel or awareness for that middle. They don't coordinate it. So whenever we're discussing that, you think about, like, the process. If you were to have a kid there, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to label your strings on the puppet. If I said, hey, Nunzio, hey, take this puppet, man, I want to see you make it dance. You wouldn't just start into drills. The first thing that you would do is you would clearly label the strings. All right, here's the finger, here's the arm, here's the front leg. And then once I had a little bit more awareness of which each string did and what their role was, then I would start to coordinate one simple move at a time, and then I would move into more complex. But the key is just kind of limiting the strings. That's why with the belt, a lot of times I like starting guys off on the knees, because too often with players in the lower half, they can't differentiate between pushing and rotating, or spinning versus rotating. As long as they turn, they feel like that it's rotation. So by starting on the knees to eliminate the knees and the feet, now can they sit there and separate their hips from their shoulders without being influenced by the feet or the knees. So that's something to really consider when you're going through that, is label their strings one at a time, limit their choices, and then just start adding simple movements before complex. So we'll go from on the knees to standing to actually moving, stepping. So that's the order in which we do it. Question?
Yeah, I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just got back into college baseball, and a couple years ago, I got to go down to Auburn and work with Butch Thompson. I got to work one of his camps, and I got to hear him speak. And everything you're saying is great. And he always talked about when guys are on the mound, we want them to move subconsciously. So how do you find that balance of, okay, he always talked about, when I drive my car, I don't look at my feet when I hit the gas or the brake, which makes complete sense. But how do you find a balance for an 18 to 22-year-old kid who might move well, but he's not there yet, and he needs to understand his body, and to create that subconscious movement in game, he's got to do a little bit more thinking in pin sets, drips, whatever. How do you find that balance for a kid, 2 hours a week that you get, 10 to 12 hours a week, whatever it may be?
Yeah, man, that's a great question, because ultimately that's the whole goal, is transfer. But I don't think it just shows up on the mound, and I don't think there should ever be, like, I like DJ's rule as far as where he says in bullpens, you're either over the rubber or you're over the plate. If I'm over the rubber, I'm thinking about my mechanics, I'm trying different stuff. If I'm over the plate, I'm just worried about executing pitches. But to me, man, it's a 4-step process. First of all, before we do anything, we're just going to kind of see how aware the guy is of his body. Can he do simple movements? Because your players that can't, they're going to, like, a lot of guys can't sit there and move their hips without their shoulders, but then they want drills for it. So first it comes with body awareness, and then we're taking the simple movements first. Once he can do that, man, and you're saying all things were good, is that what you're saying, or you're just saying just get to a mindless state?
Well, yeah, just get to that point where, we're not focusing on how the body's moving on the mound, versus we do have to do extra thinking, and we are trying to understand our body in pin sets and dry reps and whatever it may, our mental focus time. But then in game, we want to get to that subconscious delivery. So, I mean, how do we balance that? I guess that's my big thing. I
think that you train in Compton, you play in Wimbledon. And what I mean by that, the Serena Williams sisters, what they were doing, the first thing their dad taught them how to do when they were playing tennis was how to hit the ground during a drive-by shooting. So you think about that. They're sitting out there practicing, and they're thinking about how to hit the ground when they hear gunshots, but then they're playing in Wimbledon. There's no reason why they didn't win so many games in Wimbledon. I think the reason why a lot of stuff doesn't transfer is because we make practice too easy. We don't submerge that task in anxiety. So let's use – I'm gonna mute all. There's some feedback. If I knew how to work this better. All right. So with the Williams system, they trained in something. They submerged the task in anxiety. So Dr. Steele said a couple of years ago, this will go too. But you think about it as a hitter. Hitters go into BP. There's all this crazy stuff coming in. There's balls. There's screens. And then they get into a game, and it's just the hitter and the hitter's background. So it's a quiet visual background. You think about a pitcher, what do we do? Hey, man, you want to go throw a bullpen? So it's just me and the catcher. Nothing on the line, me and the catcher. There's not a hitter. There's not an umpire. But more importantly, there's nothing moving in the background. So then they get onto the mound, and all of a sudden there's all this crazy stuff that they haven't been training for. It's new to them. So a lot of times all that visual stuff going on will show up as anxiety because the brain's just not sure of it. So I think to answer your question, anybody know how to turn that buzzing off? I think to answer your question, man, it's all about just creating an environment that's tougher and more challenging than the game. And something that we'll do a lot of with the belt is that once we've got guys at that stage, we're going to create distraction. We're actually going to try to pull them off. We're going to try to pull them in different directions and still see if they can pitch. But it's just another way of adding distraction to the training. But I think you got to train for that. I don't think it just happens. Everything you see on the mound is a direct reflection of what you're doing off the mound. Does that answer it, Drew? Does that answer it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, man, can anybody give me any tips on how to turn this feedback off? Is that better?
In the bottom right, where everybody's names and column of the chat box is.
Y'all see my screen? Where's that at? I don't know. All right, next questions. We'll just keep going with it. Anything else?
Lance, I got one.
Yeah.
Nunzio brought something up my brain hadn't been able to stop since then. He talked about a high anxiety player. When he said that, I got to thinking about the guys who have slow heartbeats, the guy who have some high anxiety, just all the different personality traits and different things. And I almost feel like those guys are like, some guys are sinker slider guys. Some guys are, the guy you want on, like, just different left-handers, right-handers, not saying that, one tends to the other, but I guess I guess the question is, have y'all noticed some trends or some characteristics certain guys like that have? Man, my brain's going 100 miles an hour, not just you, but anybody else that's on the call, just some things that they've seen, just so we can meet them where they are, and not have a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'll hang up and listen.
Man, you got to think through, man, about, like, if I can separate. I'm going to mute all. Okay. I've muted everybody. I'll let you unmute yourself once you, if you have a question. So just feel free to do that. But to answer your question, Justin, I think that's something we all forget about, man, is how highly integrated and interconnected that thoughts, emotions are with movement, man, because they're all stored in the same part of the brain. And you can't have one without the other. You think about how body language is just a thought, or then an intention becomes an action. So really it's thinking about their makeup, man. Is it something that when this guy gets pissed off, he performs better, or is this anxiety or emotion? Like, let's take a guy that struggles in the first inning. It's a couple of things. Number one, it's not like it's genetic. Most of those guys struggle for one of two reasons. Number one, it's because they have no plan. It's not until they get into the game, there's a few balls driven into the gap where the hitter makes the adjustment for them that they make an adjustment. Or is it guy with lesser stuff? Because he has lesser stuff, man, he's afraid of getting hit around early. So after he gets going, he's got some momentum. Now he feels confident. Now he locates a little bit better. So that would be some of the things I would think about, would be just, how it's all highly integrated, interconnected. But I think that comes back to knowing your player and knowing the history on your player. Because if it's emotion or anxiety, man, that's something that you'd want to know and how you could possibly help. Other questions?
Yeah. So does immersing those guys that struggle with anxiety and distraction control help them learn how to deal with it, kind of to solve a problem, create a problem, and then kind of stage it out, right?
Yeah, that's what I would think for sure, man. It's just that you just want to, again, man, you want to train in Compton to play in Wimbledon. The more that you can submerge that task and anxiety, and I think the better off that you're just preparing them to pitch. I just think those quiet bullpens, which there's a time and place for, but if we're talking about transferring a skill, there has to be chaos, there has to be variability. And I'll give you an example just on like from skateboarding, man. I'll be honest, I've learned more about skateboarding than anything I've ever read about pitching, but I wanted to teach myself how to ride a skateboard. One, to hang out with my little boy, but two, I wanted to learn something I knew nothing about. So I'd sit there in the practice at Venice Beach, and I'd practice, and I got pretty good at ollieing and doing some tricks, man. But what I noticed was, as soon as I went to Venice Beach where there were other professional skateboarders, the skill just dropped. I'd start to get nervous, I'd start to get anxiety, but the visual background changed. My belief of thinking, hey, I'm going to get embarrassed right here. I wasn't willing to take the risk, so I wasn't as aggressive. So just those thoughts and emotions of being the old 45-year-old giving the thumbs up as he hauled off the gurney, it really affected the motor skills, because when I got back into the department, I was pretty good. But as soon as I got around other people I thought was better, I stood no chance. So it's all highly integrated, interconnected. Did that answer it? Other questions? All right, I want to take time that I haven't done this enough, but one guy I want to introduce that, man, I wouldn't be able to do this without him. It's a big part of everything that you guys see with Palooza and with the belt, and that's John Watson. John, say hello.
Thanks, Lance. Appreciate it. Hope everyone's doing well.
Yeah, so I want to make sure to give John a little shout out there. Any other questions with anybody?
I got one for you, Lance.
Okay.
Listening to how you just described your experience with the skateboard. All right. We've heard this in our game a lot, that sometimes guys just need a change of scenery. We've also heard that confidence comes from skill acquisition. What I've observed, and I think you just described it with your skateboard, is that confidence also comes from knowing you belong.
100%.
And I think we see it. I've seen it with players, that are really skilled. They have skill, and for whatever reason, they just can't take the bullpen to the mound. They, it's obvious, you can see it. They're just nervous. But then, they ship off to a junior college, and there's nothing changed about the skill. All that's changed is the cast of characters that's around them. And I think, like you, they're back on the skateboard again, and they really get better. They who they are comes out. My question and the challenge I've kind of taken for me as a coach is, how do I make a guy feel like he belongs? How because that's such a key. How do we do that? How do we do a better job of it? Because there's too many of them that fail for whatever reason at the beginning, and you ship them off to junior college, and the next thing you know, they're playing against you. That's my comment, my thought, and question to the group and to you.
Because we've got several of you guys. I'll put you in that category too as well, Steve. But the things I see John doing, I see James Ogden doing, I see Scott Brown, and I could literally go down this whole list, man. It's to me, coaching is about communicating. It's about building relationships. It's about connecting with players. Like one of the first things that I'm going to do, and there's better guys on the call than this to ask, but I'm always trying to connect. I'm always trying to find something that they do outside of baseball that helps me know them a little bit more, that allows me to speak in words. It's not just about baseball, but hey, you're a skateboarder. Hey, here's what I thought about skating with pitching. Oh, you're a basketball player. Here's how I think you can make pitch development more like basketball. So I'm always looking for stuff personally as for my growth outside of the range of baseball to figure out more stuff. But I've also found too that the more that you can connect on their level and you start to build that relationship, there's some belief going on there. I think that's when buy-in starts to occur. And then too, I think a big part of guys stepping outside their comfort zone or being afraid to fail, I think they're afraid not of failing, but of being criticized. So a lot of times it's eliminating that public execution or that criticism that goes a long way. But then you might have a guy that's played football his whole life and he's played for a really tough coach and that's what he likes. So I think again too is kind of if I were to ask questions, you know, who's your favorite coach? Why was he your favorite coach? Is he the kind of guy that needs you to get in his face? Is he another guy that needs backed up? Is he the guy that needs patted on the back? So it comes down to just getting to know that individual. And I think asking questions puts ownership, accountability, but at the same time, it lets them know that, hey, man, this is pretty important what I think. I've never had a coach that's done this before. So I think there's so many factors, but I think that's a great question. Did that answer you?
Yeah, and I'll tell you one of the things that really, in my last year at Auburn, I had a pitcher. I won't name him, but I had a left-handed pitcher that was really. I mean, he was a junior college transfer in, great athlete. He had come in on the heels of a partial Tommy John, but he was ready to throw when he got there. So he was out there in inter squads and things like that, but he struggled a lot. We got the season going, and he'd get the ball every once in a while on a Tuesday, and you could just see the expectation and the pressure building on this kid to the point where I just think he felt like he wasn't wanted. So he would be late. He'd be late. He was that kid that if somebody was going to be late to the bus or late to the meeting, it just happened to be him. So I took him to the bullpen one day, completely intending to just to light him up. And for some reason, we got in the pen and we sat down, and I asked him this question. I asked him, is there something about you that you wish I knew that might help me coach you better? And I had never asked anybody that question before. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, he says, but we don't have that much time. Well, even before he could finish that sentence, I'm sitting there listening to him for about 2 hours. And it's a lot like what you just described, connecting with the guy. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling you that from that point on, it took off, and he took off. And I have now, I've started, that's kind of that's a question for me now that I want to ask every single guy. And because it gets to what you're talking about. And it's a powerful question. And I didn't come up with it. I forget where I read that, but sometime during my first year of unpaid sabbatical after Baylor, I read that somewhere, and I thought, I've never asked that question, and I'm going to, and I did. I finally did it, and it really had a big impact.
Yeah, I think it's
that's why you're the best, Smitty.
Hey, Reed.
Yeah, because it is, man. Just knowing your players is so important. But too, nowadays it's as if the information, we use data, we use tech every single day, but it's almost as a society, man, we've placed a higher value on the information versus the communication part. We just assume, hey, we've got the information, you just go ahead and do it, and then we wonder why it doesn't transfer. But you got to think, all these thoughts, these intentions, these beliefs shape the movements of who they are, why they do what they do, and that's really what's being analyzed on video. So a lot of times, is it just something like you just described? The kid doesn't believe in himself. Is he nervous? Does he think he's supposed to do something else? I'll give you an example. There was a kid that I was working with mechanics. He's good at the drills, man. He could do them. We get on the mound, man, he still couldn't rotate through the ball. So, of course, I went back to drills, did more drills, get back up, same thing. So I'd been sitting there for about an hour and 10 minutes, and finally the pitching coach turned off and just the common sense popped up, and I said, man, are you trying to finish in fielding position? He's like, yeah, I thought I was supposed to. Oh, well, don't. And then it completely changed his whole delivery. But, man, if we're just gathering information as if these kids are lab rats without knowing the name or their history or their background, man, I think we're doing them a huge disservice because, man, information's just part of it. But I look at it this way, that information, the quality of information equals your communication divided by the player's interpretation, and that's how valuable the information is. So just knowing how they phrase stuff, how they do the process really matters because, man, again, it's that interpretation of what they're supposed to do that we're breaking down and analyzing as mechanics on the screen. It starts as a thought or emotion, and it's just really painting a clearer picture and getting to know your players because without that, man, you're just guessing.
And Lance, I just want to jump in on that too. Like one of the things you're great at is autonomy support. You ask guys questions, and there's really good scientific research about brain development. If you look at Desi and Ryan with like self-determination theory, or Gabrielle Wolf and skill acquisition, all those people, there's like strong research that suggests autonomy support is one of the strongest ways to get actual skill and motor learning to happen. And most of the time we as coaches stand there in front of a guy and we tell him, this is what I know. And we do not acknowledge what they know. And we haven't spent one day living in their body. And I would suggest to everybody on this call, dial up the TED Talk by Frances Fry on trust, building trust and rebuilding trust. And she says, she's a MIT researcher. She says, empathy, authenticity, and sound logic are the three things you need to build trust. It's not only sound logic, and that's generally how we all approach it. It's like, I've got all the science, but I don't dive into authenticity, and I have no empathy for your failures. So it's like, you know, we all need to check ourselves and understand the only way to get guys to do the things we want them to is to support their autonomy and understand what they actually want. Most of the time for us, that means asking a lot more questions than giving advice. And most of us miss the boat on that, myself included. So it's what you're a genius at, Lance.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. But, man, what a great point, because I agree 100%. And here's something I found that was pretty cool, man. And it goes back to what both you and Steve were saying. We look nowadays as this is the tech age. But here, this is back from 2003. So I want you guys to look at this and tell me it doesn't sound like it could have just been written today. 2003, Rick Peterson had a quote, "In God we trust, all others must have data." I'll just read the highlights. In 2003, ASMI came out and said, we have the research and necessary equipment to explain not just but why pitchers are at risk for injury. This is when they introduced the 3D motion capture. It's when they were talking about the slow motion, all the technology that we have today, they had in use back then. And then all of a sudden came the onset of mechanical models. Because Mark Pryor was successful, now every pitching coach in America wanted to look like Mark Pryor. And when it didn't work, all of a sudden he had bad mechanics. So we started to think that I can look like somebody else. And I basically became addicted to pitching mechanics. And then 2003, Baseball Prospectus asked ASMI, will you ever be able to predict those at risk for injury? He goes, yes, we're closer than you think right now based on the biomechanical markers we have in place. So here's what they're creating. They're creating this science that's filled with all this information nobody has ever had. We've got the first guy that was ever built in a lab. We're close to predicting injuries. And so we started focusing on position. So now we're attributing everything to mechanics. And they came out with the information that hip-shoulder separation, shoulder ER, greater knee extension, forward truck tilt, all those came back and said these are higher velocity. Here's what happens when you don't have those: open foot position, too much, too little external rotation, not enough hip-shoulder separation. So all these guys in lab coats come out and they say, hey, man, here's why guys are getting hurt. Here's why they're getting injured. Here's the perfect guy. So you think about what that did to us as an industry, as people. We've got scientists saying that. And so the next part of that was they were asked, you know, what's the goal? And they said the information exists for teaching proper mechanics. We feel it's our goal to get this information to the general public. So here's what I want you guys to keep in mind. From 95 to 99, there were 22 Tommy John surgeries performed on Major League Baseball players. All of a sudden, they had this new science. They had all this information that we've never had access to. They had all this technology that we've never had. 2004, they come out and say, as technology in sports science field has developed over the past 20 years, the interest has skyrocketed in using these advancements to the benefit of athletes. But did it work? Look on the left is the amount of people that got internet in their home from 2000 to 2014. So we have all this information, all this science that's coming out to prevent injuries, to cause all these problems. But look what happens. Look at the timeline for Tommy John. As the information got out, Tommy John increased. For pro guys, as the information got out, the youth guys, look at how their injuries skyrocketed, while at the same time there were fewer kids playing but getting hurt more often. It's not because of the information, it's because we're not communicating. We're getting away from the art of communication because we feel like information trumps communication, and then we're not even considering by asking questions on how do they interpret the information. You know, one of the easiest ways to kind of do that is simply, like if we were saying this earlier, but if you ask a guy, what's important to you about pitching mechanics, and hearing what they say, but how they say it. If you had to tell a guy 3 things about pitch development on how you throw your changeup, knowing how they describe, how they communicate is one thing, but 2, hearing their cues, thinking about, because anything they tell other players, they're going to believe that it's important because they wouldn't say it if it wasn't important to them. If they think it's important, they're going to practice it more. If they think it's important, they believe it's what they see as the truth. That's what they're doing with the ball. So it really gives you insight to, one, what they believe is important, because then we can start to figure out, oh, well, it's just fictional. It's not a functional issue. He just has the wrong way of looking at this. So maybe we can clear up the communication. Or number 2, it just gives you insight to what they're doing off the field, how they communicate. Man, to me, it's invaluable to ask questions and get to know the players, because that's where your answers are. To me, it's not just the information. If we just keep following this, how we're doing it, and keep trying to accumulate information, it's not the team with the most sensors who's going to win. It's going to be those who can communicate what's on the sensors. It's going to be the difference maker for guys. And I think that's something I see over and over, because when I'm looking at data, man, I think of it kind of like basketball. Data is not the answer. It's in place to ask a better question. So if data, to me, if I didn't have any data, any tech, I'm just out there shooting a basketball. I'm the one on the left. I've got no goal. I've got no feedback. I've got no net. I'm throwing stuff up. I have no idea if it's working or not. Data, to me, is putting the backboard, the rim, and the nets on the goal. So when I do make a shot, oh, I made it. Now, what if I tried this? What if I tried that? Because you think about development, man, all it is just trial and error. All we're doing is throwing shit up against the wall and seeing what sticks. Data is telling us what sticks, and then I'm letting the player name whatever he wants to name that turd and call it by whatever he wants to call it, and I'm going to repeat what he says. So I always look at data like what Drew had said earlier, man. It's just like we drive to work every day. It's the feedback we're getting from the speedometer, and we're connecting a field to the numbers, and it's really what we're shooting for is just a learned association from the data. But there's so much more that goes into that association. There's emotions, there's thoughts, there's feelings, there's the human element. And I think as a baseball society, we're disconnecting the machine from the human. And I think another part of that is you look at the SAID principle, specific adaptations to imposed demands. And adaptations are what the body does, but the imposed demands, that's something as a coach that we can control. So let's look at this example here. I'll find it. Not it. But yeah, I'm right in with you on that right there, Gabe, 100%. Give me just any other questions while I'm looking for this?
Hey, I just want to say back to the playing other sports and in the recruiting world, especially in college, any opportunity I think you can get to see a prospective athlete play a different sport, I think you gain a lot of insight into how he thinks and how comfortable he maybe is when he's pitching in particular. But yeah, I've certainly seen high-level athletes that seem to be like different people on the basketball court, on the football field, on the soccer field, and then they're a little reserved or maybe thought conscious on the mound because they've probably been overcoached. They've got the private pitching instructor. But when it comes to football, well, football is not this guy's main sport. He's going to be a big league pitcher one day. He just happens to be an all-state receiver, or whatever the case. Well, it's because he's likely not thought conscious at all. He's playing on a lot of instincts and letting his athleticism take over. And I think that's a lot of times where we can get a lot of insight again, is just watch him play as many sports as possible and encourage him to do so. I think you're going to get a lot of insight there.
I think you also give an insight too. I always like to watch when a player would fail and see how he responded too, because it tells
absolutely. Yeah.
But that's a great point, James, for sure. For sure. Still haven't found this. So,
Hey, Lance.
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yeah. I got you.
The fastball, one thing I think that, instructors, I've got a facility, but I coach college baseball too. And I think we all, we want to learn to send energy up the body and get the arm moving as fast as we can and generate velocity. But on the other side of that, when you look at Major League Baseball last year, my favorite stat, and I tweet it all the time, is that the Astros led Major League Baseball in velocity, average fastball velocity, but they used their fastball usage percentage was dead last in Major League Baseball. So are we so focused on getting the body to move? And I know if we can throw a fastball hard, we can throw a slider. I get that. But are we so focused on velocity that we're losing a little bit of, what it truly takes to get guys out? Because the numbers are showing us that since 2003, we're down like 10% in the major leagues of fastball usage.
I think it's a little bit of everything. I don't think it's one or the other there. I think that a lot of, obviously to get in the door, velocity keeps you there. And I think too that, how it changes in pro baseball, pitching backwards is just something not a lot of guys do. So, there's just so many variables that come into that, but really at the end of the day, it's about getting guys out. But as they're progressing through the levels, man, unless you throw the ball hard, sooner or later, you're going to be judged by the gun, whether you like it or not. Now, once you get there, if you want to change your persona, the landscape of how you do things to stay and survive, I think that's a different animal in itself. But I think to get there, velocity, baseball's telling us that we got to be able to throw the ball hard. But once you get there, then it's, there's so many other variables that come into play there.
Hey, Lance.
Yeah.
Hey, going back to understanding your athlete, I had introduced people coming into my gym. I started doing Angela Duckworth's grit test, and it was perfect to a person on giving me a lot of information on how an athlete deals with adversity, how willing they are to work on their own, how willing they are to work as part of a team. I tell you, that's a real useful piece of equipment. And that's a great book for any coach to read. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's Scott. Before too. Go ahead.
It's Angela Duckworth. It's called the Grit Test. They give it to the military academies on their freshmen coming in and found it. They can identify the first place she ever used it was at West Point, and to a person was able to tell the administration who was going to succeed and who was not going to succeed. And it's been used every year and in every academy since then. So it really is it's a teller of how tough someone's persona is. It's really good. So I suggest that to any coach.
Yeah, that is a good one. I've heard you say that before, but yeah, knowing the player is huge. Now here's an example. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. I'm just going to give you an example of something else too. But here's kind of what I see a lot with. We've said this earlier, but I see a lot is that you think about what baseball science is. Baseball science is based on correlations. You pick any metric that you want to make, from motion capture, whatever. You're looking at pelvis speed, you're looking at chest maximum extension, peak rotational speed, chest delay, pelvis quickness, rotational acceleration, all this stuff that happened after foot plant. So here's a guy that came into the facility, and here are his metrics right off the bat, the first time that we tested him. But what I want you guys to watch is just watch the delivery, pay attention to the back foot, the knee. But this guy simply, well, I won't tell you what it is. Watch him first. Here are his metrics. We're going to go back through this. All right. So first thing was his idea of hinge was just to lean over. The second thing is watch how he swings that. Watch his back foot. So swings until he goes to his heel. So then he's going to go to the ball with his foot and he's going to push out. So as he pushes out, you know, separation or how the chain works is segmented rotation. So if I'm pushing from the ball, the foot, that's never going to happen anyway. So he's going to swing open with the front. And there. So you look at his numbers, and let's just use one, for example, chest delay, 80 milliseconds. So here he is. So John has the idea, and this goes back to the specific adaptations to impose demands. The specific adaptations that we're talking about, that's the human element. So over here, these are the numbers that science says, hey, are important. So typically we look at those numbers and we say, all right, man, that's the data. That's what you need to do. You've got to find a way to increase hip-shoulder separation. So they'll spend 3-4 weeks working on hip-shoulder separation when that's not the problem. Guys, what happens at landing more than likely has already happened. Like hip-shoulder separation, the quickest way to solve a problem is by creating a problem. So here's what John did. John takes the PVC pipe. You can barely see it, but he puts it in between his knees. So we showed the guy how to hinge. And as coaches, we can control the imposed demands we put on players. So really, when you think about it, movement's just problem solving. So all John did was put the PVC pipe there and said, hey, man, don't let your kneecap hit this. Watch this. See the difference in that? And then you're going to see, if you wanted to just stop frame by frame, you're going to see how much more. Well, now he's got a 365 millisecond, but his pelvic rotational, his quickness jumped up 2,000. His peak rotational speeds jumped up 2,000. And all we did was just create a problem for him to solve without any drills. So always keep in mind that that data is just in place to ask better questions. It's not the answer. It's, well, what if we tried this? What if we tried that? What if we tried this? But even more powerful is when you give the player that, like, what would you try? All right, let's try it. What's it matter? It doesn't matter because we don't have the answer anyway. And as long as we're just basing it on information and not asking better questions, man, we're going to keep what we've been doing since 2003 and seeing a skyrocket in injuries because you think, man, this whole society of baseball, it's just, I always thought about this. Think about the groups that believe in magic. We always think there's a secret drill or there's these secret biomechanical markers. And I hear people all the time say, well, what's the feel for the hips? How do you teach the feel? And when I hear that, right away, it tells me there used to be this guy that behind us my mother took care of, and he was illiterate. And so a lot of times he would use our words, but he would use them out of context. I know I'm the first because, longer story, but college algebra took me 4 years to get through that. I knew how smart the teacher was the first year, but I didn't understand how smart he was until the fourth year. So that's what we're doing as a society. We're throwing all these technical terms. The pitchers don't understand this, are repeating back what they think they're supposed to say. So, of course, they're believing in a magic drill because they don't know any different. So at the same time, that puts our scientists and our guys that speak real technical on this platform because they speak in a way we don't understand. Wow, he must be smarter than us. So now we're dividing that information and communication even further because of how we talk, because we put all our emphasis on the information and not the communication. That's why we're seeing all the problems that we're having. We keep going in that area. We've got to be able to communicate. And the things that we control, the quickest way to change an output, change the input, man. If you don't like the red Kool-Aid, put grape in there if you don't want it to turn red. But those are the things that we can control. It's about creating speed bumps, challenges, and just communicating. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important too to document their feedback. You know, whether that's them making notes, journaling themselves, or you making a quick note after a session or practice or whatever. Just in terms of the nervous system and how plastic it is, you know, things change. What they think is important today may not be important in 6 months or from freshman to junior year or low level rookie ball to double A. You know, we're gonna educate ourselves along the way, and their feedback is always going to be top priority.
And I think that you're right on. I think that's why that it's got to be a sample size of one when we're talking about player development.
Yeah.
Like, what does their data tell them? It doesn't matter what the average is for this age or that age or this level. It really doesn't matter because you could tell me that Rex is in the 94th percentile. That's great, but he's not going to grow anymore. But I can I'm going to focus on his nutrition. It's going to be totally different for each one. But I think too often, man, we take the science, we stack them in silos, and then all of a sudden we think that's how it's got to be for everybody. And man, that's what we've been doing since 2003. And you think about this, we look at those studies now and we laugh about, hey, you had to stay closed, or a longer stride was the key to velocity. But here's the thing, man, that's the same information we got access today. It's all about how they interpreted it. So it's going to be different. You could give 15 coaches the same information. You're going to get 15 different answers because of their association, their interpretation, what they believe is important is all going to matter. And when they capture the data, they're looking for what they believe is important, because if they didn't believe it was important, they wouldn't look for it. So it really comes down to interpretation and application, because it's different for everybody. And then one last thing that kind of touched on what you said is, I'm a big believer, like if a guy's working a breaking ball or curveball, let them leave the field with a good curveball. No more one more, because what happens is when they leave that field and they feel good about it, they show up the next day believing they have a good curveball. If they leave the field that day and the curveball was shitty because you kept letting them do it and do it and do it, well, they're going to show up the field believing they don't have a very good curveball, man. And beliefs are huge, man. I often tell our pitchers that if you want to see your potential, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a sheet of paper out. You've got as much room as you would like. What are your chances for being the best pitcher in this room? What are your chances for being the best pitcher on this team? And you'll really get a good idea of how they see themselves. You know, those are going to be our beliefs. The bigger the circle, the better they usually are. So you'll start to see how they interpret themselves. And then what we're doing inside that circle is we're just writing it down, everything we have 100% control over. If we can't control it, we don't worry about it. So we're trying to build our circle from the inside out. And then pretty soon that circle starts to engulf what was previously outside our circle. So, man, I'm a huge believer, in the power of belief and how important that is in development. But I think a lot of that comes from buy-in and asking questions and stating a lot of stuff that you guys have talked about, of just starting with the relationship, building trust, communicating. Because once you've got the communication down pat, it's going to clean up the coordination for sure.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the challenges now more than ever, you referenced this earlier in that PowerPoint, of how much information is available to them. So if you're going to encourage them to ask questions and not really have any answers for them, then you're eventually going to get exposed, right? Because they're going to go home, they're going to Google it, they're going to call pitching coach from high school, they're going to talk to their buddy who has an instructor, or they're just going to constantly be, looking for answers, and you're not holding up your end of the bargain,
Yeah,
so I think that's a challenge.
That's huge. You're right on about that, because a lot of these guys are coming in more educated than us. And so the worst thing you can do is just give them some answer and thinking they're dumb. They're going to believe whatever you tell them, because then that can expose you. And a lot of times they might be doing it just to challenge you, just to kind of be very passive aggressive in doing so. So I think with that, whenever a kid does that to me, I'm always bouncing back with whys, like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that? Oh, cool. Well, because it does this. Oh, really? Well, why do you say? Just pounding them with whys, and then pretty soon they're either going to know exactly what they were saying, or you're going to figure out whether they were just trying to get you. But the more that you can ask why, you can start to deflect and get a little bit more understanding of why he's asking you that stuff too.
Yeah, no doubt.
Other questions?
Yeah, hey, Lance, I got one, and kind of directing this towards James and Nunzio as well. And James, congratulations, by the way, on your new gig this year. Sorry it got interrupted.
I appreciate that, man.
But, us having the advantage, or us an advantage, that we're blessed to be able to work with athletes at all different levels. And Lance, when we met up, early in the spring, I asked you this question, and I'm still kind of fighting it. I love what I'm hearing. I love hearing these guys, and we work with professional athletes and college athletes, but we're offering programs from, with our strength trainers and nutritionists, and what we're doing on the throwing side, dealing with high school athletes, especially being in Houston, Texas, where we have a high select baseball. We have a lot of games that are going into the summertime. Our guys are not getting, they're not getting an off season. And this is a battle that we're fighting. And we talk about injuries in the rise and what's going on at the professional levels. I'm still believing that a lot of this is happening at the youth and adolescent levels, and it's carrying over, right? And you talk about it with all the information. I'm not real sure, I guess, what my direct question is, but I'm having a really difficult time in figuring out exactly what the right program is and mixing it in with these selected travel tournaments on the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I understand that it is a choice for the athlete And I understand that they have to allow themselves to get the off season as well. But down here in Texas, and you guys know California, Florida, all over, right? The idea of recruitment, the idea of what they need to be doing and playing select baseball, whether they're recruited or not. Most of these guys aren't getting exposure. They're getting exposed. They're not ready to be there in front. But we're having a hard time programming these guys from the strength side, right, to the throwing recovery and applying the core velocity belt because of the time that we need with them. It's being taken. So any advice you guys could throw our way to start, I'd love it.
Man, I'd say right out the bat that's a struggle, and that's a real struggle that a lot of people are facing, obviously. But I don't mean to just keep saying the same thing, but maybe I do. I think the more that they can play other sports, the more likely you are to gain levels of proprioception and movement awareness that you otherwise wouldn't in specializing in a year-round sport. Especially baseball, especially being a pitcher, especially being a pitcher only.
James,
yeah.
I don't want to cut you off. So last year in our summer program in 2019, we had 125 high school athletes in our program, and only 2 of them in Texas played another sport. That's where we're at.
That's a problem. That's back to what Lance was just talking about with belief. I think the problem is we've created this belief that that's absolutely necessary. And, the financial gains that are involved with that, I think, are realistically a factor. And, guys are making a lot of money off of summer teams and facilities, and it's more prevalent than ever. But I just think that part of that injury epidemic as well is that they're not getting the movement that they otherwise would if they were skating or swimming or playing football or whatever, gymnastics, not just the volume and the workload and the lack of a real break, but just the movement itself, the overall body awareness that is gained by playing another sport that requires a completely different set of skills, a completely different mentality in some ways, and different teammates. It's just further proof to me that contrast is really the key to development. I just wouldn't want to specialize in anything until I felt like that athlete was ready to be in college or on to being a professional, et cetera. And I just, pitcher onlys are the death of young athletes. I wish it didn't exist.
The other thing I would say is, from owning a strength and conditioning facility, a lot of times, you're right. We're being brought up to specialize more and more. But if kids can get in a weight room and move around, even when they aren't playing another sport, they're being exposed to different movement patterns every day. So while it is better to play a different sport, multiple sports, I believe as well, you can prevent kids. Another thing I'm finding is that the buy-in that we're starting to get from younger kids, understanding that they need to move better, maybe play other sports and get stronger. Another way to put that is, don't be afraid to tell a kid that you may be going to a showcase and showcasing yourself off the list, instead of going there and, you're 17 years old and you're 6'2" and you throw 78 miles an hour, and you're going to go there and your dad's going to get you to throw, and I think people are starting to buy in to the fact that, if you're not ready, you might be better off not doing that. But yeah, the multiple sports things is key. And also, young kids just aren't strong. You're not born with that type of strength to be that explosive. You have to develop that. Some kids got it better genetically, but no matter what, I think there is a buy-in happening. It's slow, but I think it's happening.
And that's great, because Derek, I know what you're saying. Like, it sounds great to say, hey, you got to play these other sports, but that's probably not realistic, especially with our culture today. And again, it comes back to the information they're receiving. That's important. We're an illiterate society, honestly. So you think about it, like, I like how Nunzio said that, like, increasing proprioception through other movement patterns, through the weight room, through different things. So if you look at this screen here, people always are asking me, man, how long will it take for it to transfer? What will it take? So I look at it this way. I always think that movement tells a story. So The keypad is the same for every sport. That's the human body. So if I put baseball on the screen, it's the same keypad. If I put basketball, if I put hockey, it's the same keypad. So if we thought about all the keys, if I've been familiar with the keys, you can even think the keys are the data. You think as we start to type, man, we've got a clear goal in mind of what we're trying to do. We're probably saying the words as we speak it. So as we're going through this, we're seeing mistakes. We're getting instant feedback. We're saying the words. So we get pretty good at the keyboard. You got to think that we can feel the difference between an L and a K or an L and a P, even though it's millimeters apart without ever looking at it. You look at most kids, they can do that. So if we could build that kind of proprioception with the body, it would be even better. So when I look at the speed or the rate of transfer, I think it first starts with proprioception, because without that, coordination doesn't exist. Proprioception is just knowing where your body parts, being able to turn on smaller parts versus bigger parts. There's a lot that goes into it we'll discuss later. But knowing, like, if each letter on that keypad was like a muscle firing, I'm going to label my keys. As I start to click 3 or 4 together, that's a movement. So then I take the movements, I'm still typing, so I turn the movements into words. And then as I string a couple of words together, that's a sequence. That's a sentence now. So now that I got a couple of sentences, I'd string it together to tell a story. But if you've got a guy that doesn't know his strings, no matter what sport, he's going to sit there and he's going to be slow to peck, and he's just not going to be very fluent or very literate as far as how the keyboard goes. And that's what's going to show up. So the more that they can do exactly what Nunzio just said, man, I think they're just labeling their keys better. I think they tell a better story, and I think they do it a lot quicker and more efficient than somebody else.
I appreciate it, guys.
And the last thing I'd say, if you can get them into a gym with Nunzio, then you're probably doing the right things. They don't need to play another sport. But that's the hardest part too, is finding guys that know what the fuck they're doing, that are going to help these guys be better athletes without having to play other sports. But that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Lance, and looking at your what you've got on the screen right there, you know, I think just looking at it tells a huge story. You know, we're taking kids who are typing on a screen where there's no feel. And when you first start to get in the feel, you gotta have the letters on the keyboard. But when you get over to the one where there's no letters on it, the one thing that is there is those 2 little notches, so you can know where the F and the J are. Because until you know where the F and the J are, you'd screw that other keyboard up too. But getting them from getting them from the screen, which is what they're on right now, there's no feel on that. But once you get on the real keyboard, you can kind of get it done on that. So I just saw that. I thought that was a great example there.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think too, you could say those bumps on that also give a foundational movement, like a starting point too. Let's just start there, and then we can figure it out from there. And that's great. But yeah, that's how I see it too. And I think that too often, man, what I see as coordination problems are just because they don't have it. So let's think about, like, when people say feel nowadays, it's kind of crazy on how badly I think that we miss it. And most people, when you say feel nowadays, they think of it as old school. So here's kind of what I have with the new school versus old school, is that, oh, it feels good. They think that feel doesn't matter as if it doesn't exist. And so we've got a lot of guys are collecting all this data. We're using high-tech $1 million machines to do it. And then once we find the problem, we're searching YouTube for a drill that's been an old school drill that's been around 10 years to solve the problem. It really doesn't make sense to me. So when you think about feel, 1, there's a physical sensation. You know, I could touch you, I could poke you. 2, is there a perception? So I'll give you an example of the difference between sensation and perception. Like sensation, it would be like you can actually feel it. Perception would be knowing what that feel is, right? So like my little boy was fishing, and he'd always fished in the pond. So whenever he would throw it out and the line tightened, he would have that physical sensation of a tight line. And so pretty soon he knew there was a catfish on the other end. So we go out to the Pacific Ocean. There's an old man beside us. He's throwing his reel in. He feels the tension from the current, still same physical sensation, jerks up the pole, there's no fish. So he's wondering, how does that old man catch the fish? We're using the same bait, we're using the same rod and reel, everything's the same, but he can catch it. It wasn't until he caught a few fish that he understood the difference between what a fish felt like and what the current felt like. And really, that's where experience comes into play, but that's the difference between sensation and feel. Another part would just be a learned association. Like I can close my eyes and I can feel where the L is on the keyboard without having to look at it. I can feel like the data, the speedometer, and know what the difference between 35 and 75 feels like. So there's a lot, face has many feel, a feel has many different faces. So it's important to kind of differentiate those because they're not all the same. And when we start to use them out of context, it really starts to cause some problems and some confusion more than anything, I think. Questions? Anything specific that you guys wanted to cover? Nobody? Have we answered all the questions?
Hey, Lance, I have a quick question regarding the belts. Not to put you on the spot here, but I still got a few belts that I need to send in. Are they
just send them in.
Going right now? Okay, so good.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Anything else? All right, here's something I probably, go ahead. Somebody had something?
So what does the core velocity belt have to do with everything that we just talked about?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's probably the best question to start right there. When people ask me what the core velocity belt does, you know, when I first got it, I thought it was an overspeed device. I thought it would just make me go faster. Soon realized that's not the case. Like the thing that the core velocity belt does is by creating pressure in that midsection, that hip, we create proprioception. And so many players, they can't feel that. Because they can't feel it, they can't coordinate it. Because they can't coordinate it, they're not very stable. So there's a lot of things that go hand in hand with that. But really with the core velocity belt, what it does is by the pressure that it creates, it heightens the brain's attention because the brain doesn't know if it's a core velocity belt or a boa constrictor. So because it gets the brain's attention, now it's more focused, so it creates more awareness. Because your body's now more aware through the middle, now you're able to move more efficiently through. So because whenever you take that belt off, you'll hear a lot of guys say, hey man, I feel lighter, I feel faster. Is that really what's happening? No, it's targeting the brain, it's grasping its attention. And once you take the belt off, the brain's attention is still there. So now that they're more aware of the center part of their body, the arms and the legs are able to work a little bit more efficiently. But that's really what it does. It's just heightens awareness. And so guys who are just starting with it, one of the first things that we do is just put it on 20 minutes a day without any cords attached. Because just by heightening that awareness, man, all of a sudden they're going to start to move better because they're more aware of their body. Good question. Anybody else? We good? Okay. Go back to here. Any topics that you guys want to cover with the belt? A couple of things that I would note with the belt, man, is number one, people are always asking, like, what's the best drill or what are your top three? It really comes down to what you're trying to do, man. Again, it comes down to sample size of one. And you can't really be wrong with the belt as long as you have clear intentions of what you're trying to do. I think the only way you go wrong with the belt is just by putting them on there and just hoping something's going to happen, because really it comes down to what are you trying to do with it. And I think the more you can mix it up, the better, because you got to realize that anytime I can go slow versus fast or right versus left, that type of contrast starts to really help you understand better. Doing it right versus wrong, the more that you can do it, the better off that you're going to be. Because to me, contrast is the fuel to development. It gives the brain defined parameters of what's right, what's wrong, because it's kind of hard to feel what's right when you can't feel what's wrong. So the more you can mix it up, the better, because I think the worst thing anybody could do is the same thing every single day. And the brain craves novelty. So the more you can mix it up, the better off that you're going to be. And I think that's something a lot of people miss the boat, is thinking, hey, it's got to be done this way, this way, this way. But it really doesn't. Just having a clear intent and just trying different stuff. A lot of times just giving it to the players and watching what they do with it is another good way to learn it. But that's us, man. We just mix it up as much as possible. And we look at it more as a menu that they get to choose from, rather than saying, hey, here's exactly your diet for the day and for tomorrow.
Yeah, I would say to add to that too, man, that a couple of easy ways to maybe at least make the job a little more difficult, a little harder would be where you put it on. A lot of guys tend to kind of wear it too high at first if they haven't been using it, training with it a lot. They put it up around the torso. It's just something to pay attention to as an entry point if you're thinking about using it or you have been. I just think that's very important. And then the other is monitoring the band tension, because I think you can set a guy up to where you're just kind of yanking him all over the place, and he's immediately frustrated, and you lose his attention immediately just because it's a little unrealistic, So that goes back with feel and intuition a little bit. Use your own good judgment and continue to ask questions, man. How does that feel, or how's the tension there? And they're going to give you a lot of the answers you're looking for.
That's a great one, because that's the first thing I see is guys putting up too high. And then too, like, less is more when it comes to the tension on that thing. You don't want too much. More is not better. Less is more. So watch when they're getting set up. Is it affecting their feet? Are they having to lock out their legs? Or are they having to make compensations before they ever start? Another way to look at it too is after they make the throw, do you still see it pulling them? Because once they land, there should be no tension. We want just enough tension at the very beginning to even use it. But so those are some really big ones to watch. But I'll be honest with you fellas, is that the more I see the problems, like I don't think players have hip shoulder separation problems. I don't think that's a pitching problem. I think first, if a guy can't stand and separate his hips from his shoulders, no drill is going to work anyway. So if I can't do it standing still, I'm definitely not going to be doing it on one leg, throwing to a hitter, worrying about the guy at first base while moving down a hill. It doesn't work that way. So the more I get into this stuff, man, we just use it for a lot of making up stuff on the spot. We'll spend a lot of time hinging. We'll do a lot of stuff hooked in front, hooked behind. But the more the benefit I see to just getting on the mound and mixing it up and going through your delivery, I'm just starting to veer away from drills, because I've never seen any drill where, hey, they can do this drill and then all of a sudden it instantly transfers. How I've seen results is by creating constraints, by causing them problems, by putting PVC in front of them, by if they're going to their heel, I'm going to try to pull them to their heel so they start to self-correct, because I think that's where the change happens. It's never going to be about a drill, because if drills solved all of our problems, man, we're not short on drills, but we still got plenty of pitching problems. And I think that's where it comes from, is we're always looking for a drill when you got to think about it, man. It's just a series of movements. And if they don't get the first move right, they're not going to get the last move right.
I was gonna say that a lot of times when I see people using the core velocity belt on social media, it's always in that same position where they're pulling them down the mound to get them to drift, or to get them to get their center of mass moving. And I've found that, like, don't sleep on pulling them back and letting them have to feel that, keeping that center of mass on their foot and having them start to get on the inside of that foot as they come down the mound, so that helps them drift as well. So pulling, I find that creating that stability, like you were just saying, sometimes constraint drills, pulling them from the back, I find a lot of times just resisting in the back and pulling them onto the outside of that foot, and making them feel that that's not really necessarily where they want to go, makes them actually have to learn how to stabilize and strengthen the inside of that calf, so they can actually learn to actually pull that in that adductor, and actually start to actually get their center of mass moving from the bottom up, not from the core, but then, you know what I'm saying, yeah. tilting the leg, the foot in by pulling them back instead of always pulling them down the mound.
Yeah, I think it's just about mixing it up, just like what you're saying. The more that you can mix it up, the more contrast, the better the understanding they have for their body. And that's when you're going to start to see changes. Because really any change happens at the nervous system, but we're still focused on the muscular as if drills are going to fix the problem. I often look at it like we train our players like they're headless horsemen, and then we talk to them like we're plastic surgeons instead of pitching coaches. So they're really confused on what's really happening. But the more that you can introduce it, because at the end of the day, man, movement's about problem solving. It's going to be different for everyone. And I think something that we as a culture have done is that we're talking about human movement, man. Think about this. I'll give whoever on here $1,000 if you can sign your name the exact same way twice. You can't do it. It's impossible. So think about something that simple, one hand, no stress, no base runners. We can't do that. But then we're talking about perfect mechanics. It's just not ever going to happen. So I think as a society, what we've done with data is we associate data as math with numbers. Because it's math, there's a definitive answer. It's either right or wrong with math. There's no gray area. So we're trying to put a definitive answer to an infinite problem, and we're not ever going to find perfect pitching mechanics because they don't exist. They're going to be different for everybody. So we've got to look at the data and the number as a what if scenario. What if we tried this? What if we tried that? And you never know what's going to work because everybody's going to interpret it different. Everybody's going to perceive it different. Everyone's going to move a little bit differently. So it's all about trial and error. And the beauty of that is we don't have to be the expert. We can constantly be the learner and constantly put the power on their plate by asking, well, what if you tried this? What if you tried that? And then once you give them that type of ownership, they start to see results. And how would you describe what you just did? That was awesome. Oh, I stayed back. All right, from now on, stay back. So it's really just trial and error and connecting that way. But I think the communication part, I think the mixing it up, the contrast, the more that you can add. But it really comes down to having a clear intention with what you're trying to do, because if you don't have your goal that you're shooting for, how do you ever know if you made it?
In terms of data, it just seems like data isn't interdependent of human nature and the human element. And our goal really should be to marry the two, marry the data to the human nature to create the feel, and whatever that feel is. But in terms of the belt too, I don't think there's anything wrong with using progressions for activation. But when you're using on the mound or for skill specific work or you're trying to influence a specific movement in the guy's delivery, I think ultimately you're going to find infinite ways to do that with that individual until it's kind of a light bulb thing, right? Like we're finding a whole lot of ways how not to do it to find one that is. And then eventually you start to create your own database of when you see this tends to help with this setup tends to help with this. And then they ultimately figure it out on their own. But again, in terms of activation, I think there are some staples. There's certainly nothing wrong with mixing in an appropriate volume. Just to get the body ready to do what you want it to do. I mean, ultimately, the belt is like a universal tool, right? I mean, you can do a whole lot of shit with it. It doesn't just have to be helping a guy move on the mound better.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the first place, and you're right about the staple movements. And when I was referring to that, I was talking about just the throwing activities as far as just constantly mixing it up. But the first place, man, is teaching them how to hinge. Most guys they don't know how to do that. We want to talk about ground force, and let's just kind of use this example. Use this. When I think about ground force, let's visualize ground force, and we'll go back to this here. Is that think about in order to apply ground force, I'm trying to put all three, like this picture here of this foot. I'm trying to put all three, plug them into the ground. By doing that's a vertical shin. The way I get the vertical shin is by hinging back. If my knees start to go forward, I get quad, I'm going to pull up the heel. Now I'm on the ball of my foot. Because I do that, I do what you see here. So really it starts with that foundational movement of being able to hinge, because if you can't hinge, you can't really discuss ground force, because it's just not ever going to happen. So the foundational movement for the hinge to me is step one. Once they can learn to hinge, then you're going to have a better chance, obviously, for rotation and some more just efficient patterns, because I'm getting the first part right. It's going to set me up for the final part. But I'd have to say that's the number one thing that I see players struggling with is just the ability to hinge. Anybody else?
Lancey, I got a quick question for you, man. So when you're talking about, or when we're working with guys with the belt, how much time are you spending with guys on the opposite side of that, right? Working both. We were in a conversation. I was in a conversation last night with some guys. We were actually talking hitting, not pitching, but it applies, and certainly working both sides of your body is not a revolutionary thought. But we were talking about the three most efficient moving hitters that we've had in our program here recently, and they were all left-handed hitters and right-handed throwers, right? So they had a constant equilibrium of rotation that they were doing repetition-wise. And so how much in terms of efficiency of movement applies to that balanced workload as well in terms of rotation?
Man, I think that's a great point. I was having the same discussion about – I've seen the same thing, Rob. So here's how one thing that I like for pitchers especially is days of recovery working the non-dominant side. And then we'll mix in something, some form of contrast, right, left, slow, fast, something every day. It's kind of like a sensory sauce that we call it. We're just spreading on top of it. But the non-dominant is a big part. So when you think about, like, let's go to this. Let's go to this map right here on how the brain views this. So let's say this is my map right here. So picture that map. Get you a good picture of that. Got it? So now what we're going to do is, if it looked like this, let me go. Can you guys see me? Can you guys see me? Okay. So let's think about proprioception, how that's mapped. Because I use my right side, here's half the map. Because I use it more often, I've got a pretty clear idea of what that map looks like, right? So by going to the left side, what it does, it's like it's unfolding the map. Now it's creating a clearer lay of the land on that left side. So I'm more aware of it. I've created more proprioception because I'm starting to use it more. Because I'm using it more, now all of a sudden, because I had more proprioception, I start to have more coordination. So now that side of my body is working more efficiently because the brain's aware of it, it's mapped it more clearly. Now suddenly with the increased proprioception comes improved coordination. Because I'm getting more efficient on this side, that's my braking side. Because my braking side is working more efficient, now it's going to allow the opposite side to accelerate a little bit faster. So I think that's what's happening there. And then two, it's the idea of taking a kid that's uncomfortable on one side to make him more comfortable on the other side. So the more that you can give a player like that, the better. But it's something I really like to do on the recovery side. And we'll even throw plyo balls with that. We'll even go slow motion. So if we're constantly rotating around the front hip, we're going to go slow motion where we're unloading around the hip. We're going to work backwards around that. Another way that we do that is instead of doing reps, we do breath counts. So as I'm going through a motion, I'm going. And so I'm going to say a 3 breath count would be something that's super slow motion. So as I'm going through the movement, it's super slow motion. I'm trying to connect the rhythm of the movement with the breath. So it's not ever. So I'm trying to, from the time that I start breathing till the time that I finish, I'm trying to keep the breath integrated with the movement so it's not choppy. And that's another way we found, because when you can start to integrate the breath with the movement, man, that's when guys really start to become more efficient and more aware of their body. And that's something we've seen. The guys that breathe better are typically your better movers as well. Guys that are choppy breathers are typically choppy movers. So hopefully did that answer your question, or at least get you in the right direction. But as far as the balance of it, I think it's something that definitely needs to be heavy on the days of recovery. And I would use it in some aspect every single day.
Yeah, no, that does answer. I know one of the, because one of the fascinating sort of, I don't call it a case study or whatever, but was a kid that I was fortunate enough to coach, kind of good timing on my part, but I was lucky enough to coach Pat Vendetti, the switch pitcher, right? And to get more in depth to the story of how his dad basically developed him, since he was 6 years old, and to hear the things that they were doing in order to develop that was a lot of kicking footballs with both legs and shooting layups, jumping off both legs and shooting basketballs with both arms, and just this constant balance of movement, right? And training of feel and proprioception to both sides of the body, and not being specific just to one, is obviously a lot of what led him to be able to do what he does, which is obviously pretty fascinating. So I find it a pretty interesting topic when you're talking about trying to create efficiency and movement and feel, that doing things on both sides of the body can have a pretty profound effect to becoming better at whatever your dominant side might be.
There's no question. Something too, my little kids are using as guinea pigs. And so we've got a little movement with the PVC exercise with Rex. So he'll go left-handed down the street. So as his hands come down, his leg goes up as he moves out. So he's just basically like a harmonica, where he's just like a puppet. And so what we did, we tested this. So he was trying to dunk a basketball. It's like 7.5 feet tall. And so he could touch the rim, but he goes down without knowing this. So he goes through that hands down, out, where he takes steps down to the mailbox, then he comes back up right. Wouldn't you know, he could dunk the ball after that, immediately after doing that. 2 days later, he couldn't do it again until he did exactly that, where those contralateral movements, and then he could dunk it again afterwards. But I thought that was really cool on what I thought it was doing. And I sent Dr. Seals, neurosurgeon, that question, and he thought the same thing. Because the brain was more clearly mapped, it was greater coordination. Because of coordination, he was able to synchronize the muscle groupings to be able to jump a little bit higher too. So I thought that was really cool.
Oh, that is cool, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So anything like that.
I think that's a big piece there, and touching on your question there too, Rob. Like Scott Lando hit me with this years ago about the slow dosing method with the belt too, to where you're finding small pockets of windows of time throughout the day to give these guys a little bit of movement work. Whatever it is. If we're speaking about using the belt, then that's what we're doing. But it can be done with anything, right? But especially with the belt, the more they're getting it on, the more you're forcing them to kind of answer their own questions with movement. I think you're slowly and surely feeding that sensory loop more and more to where now they're able to increase coordination when it's time to perform. So that slow dosing versus trying to get like everything jammed into an hour, give them sessions of 15 minutes throughout the day.
I've always seen this said, and Mark Tressler said this when you were at Palooza 2 years ago. He says, anytime you're working a proprioceptive exercise, it's important that you don't ever keep that exercise at over 30 seconds because you'll start to recruit secondary muscles. And so it's in short bursts with that as well. So I thought that was pretty interesting too. But in baseball, we don't have to worry about that because, of the game that we play. But I thought that was interesting. Other thoughts?
Lance, do you guys think it's okay to kind of chunk it up throughout the week as well? Because we'll have our athletes come in multiple times throughout the week, where one day we'll focus on kind of the movements and activation of it. One day we may focus on hip hinging, and then one day we may kind of put it all together. And I mean that maybe before our pre-pitch work with the belt, but today this is how we're going to activate, focusing on movements, the next day hip hinging, and maybe the next day screwing the hips in, and then one day put it all together. How do you guys feel like, something more like that?
What we do is this, and I'll pull up the CVB classifications. Hold on. We keep them, and Scott Brown is a master of this too, I think. He does such a good job of just giving his guys, just a menu. I always look at like development as kind of like, I'm giving you freedom inside the backyard fence. You can do whatever you want to inside the fence, but you got to stay inside the fence. So what we'll do with guys is that we'll do it a couple of ways. We always take 4 staples, and that's going to be anchor your hammock. So the first thing that we're going to do, they're going to be able to pick a couple of exercises from just a basic hinge. Is that pulling them away? What's that doing? The second part that we're going to do is we're going to go into a corkscrew the hips type activity. So I'm just sitting there, I'm working on just corkscrewing the hips. The next thing that we're going to do, we're going to spin some type with the ride, the slide, and then finally funnel the front, which is just rotating around the front. And these are just the list of exercises that we can choose from. And then at the same time, if they've got some that they've come up with, then we're going to do that as well. Another thing that we'll do is, here's like the contrast variations that you'll see here. We'll go dominant, non-dominant. We'll go slow versus fast. We'll go right versus wrong, left versus right, heavy versus light, hooked in front versus behind, different angles, different distance, hooking it to the top, hooking it to the bottom, hooking it to both. So again, it's always about mixing it up. But what we're doing with that is if we're testing the stuff and we're actually throwing, we're going to put the modus, we're going to put the rep soda, we're going to put whatever it is, and we're going to test this with a clear goal in mind, and then we're going to see if it works. If it tends to work for that guy, I'm going to do it more often for that guy. But we're just putting those guys and letting them choose. We don't say, hey, you've got to do these, but you do got to have to do this list. Pick one from this category, pick one from this category, pick one from this category. And if you start to eliminate, well, you've already used that one. Now you've got 4 left. Now you've got 3 left. So that forces them to do different things, but at the same time, it gives them a choice. It gives them an option, and they know exactly what they've got choices to do. And that gives you an idea too from just sitting back and watching what they do like to do.
Yeah, I think it's probably important too to understand what they like and why they may not like a certain other type of movement, and maybe on those days, kind of forcing them into those movements.
Yeah, you want to force them uncomfortable too, because a lot of guys say, well, that just doesn't feel comfortable. Well, hopefully that's probably the goal, because if you've been doing it wrong, I want you to be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Scott, you got anything?
You asking me, Lance?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things of just listening to you guys and people over the course of the last 6 weeks and just talking to a lot of people is, as coaches, we always feel the urge that we have to teach them something. And, just I talked to a longtime college coach that entered his first year in professional baseball this past year, and he, walked around the complex before it got, canceled. He just talked about, he said a couple coaches were saying to him like, "Hey, we got to teach these guys how to play catch. We got to teach these guys how to do this." And he's like, "Those two guys right there are going to be fine. Those guys are going to play in the major leagues. We don't always need to be teaching people or players something all the time." And I think, as coaches, one of the things I look at now is, it's easy to draw up like fancy dancy drills. It's easy to draw up a formula you think is going to work for the player. It's easy to, prescribe these catch plays that you really think are going to look really good on paper. And, when they go out, they're going to perform all this stuff. But the question is it translate to the mound? And it's the same thing with a core velocity belt. And, what we do, and the way I operate on that is they get an opportunity to choose anything they want to do. And, I'm trying to lead them to the water, really, is what's happening. They're my horses. And I ask them a lot of questions. If they have a question I don't know the answer to, I tell them I don't have the answer. I don't have that answer right now. I'm going to try to find out for you. But I think you have the answer. And what happens is they start to develop their own cues and an understanding of different things. And, when I get on these talks, the things that really stick with me are the experiences shared. Like, Steve Smith shared a great experience tonight. And, we start thinking about experiences with players and how to adapt them. And I just talk about a couple quick ones. I was on the phone with Walker Buehler last week, and we were just talking about it. He said, "Hey, Brownie, can you call me at 5 o'clock for happy hour? I want to have a skull session for old time's sakes." And we started talking some pitching stuff, and I asked him a simple question. I said, "Walker, I used to teach the chair drill when I was a young coach, and I'm actually doing it right now with my 11-year-old son, because I think it's one of the best drills, like to translate the feel of the center, and really, the lead leg getting some force acceptance, especially for a young kid, getting the feel of that without doing anything and throwing different objects in his hand." And I said, "You're the only pitcher that I've ever coached that would ever do that drill. And you brought it to me at Vanderbilt. Yet you would never do it unless it was just me and you one-on-one. You didn't do it like in your lead-up stuff daily. But if we had a one-on-one session down in the pitching lab, you would do it." And he's like, "Yeah, because, I knew it was good, but I didn't want the guys thinking I was stupid. Was looking at me and laughing." So when I think about these things, we were just down there playing one day, and he was having a problem with his lead leg. And I said to him, he was on the chair, and I just said to him, like, "Where do you feel the most stable? Where do you feel the most powerful? Where, these are the questions." And I said, "Let's just use your toes, for example, on your lead foot, your lead leg. When your toes are pointed at 12, you seem to have like some lateral wobble and instability. When they're pointed at 1 o'clock, do you feel very stable? If they're pointed at 2, do you feel more stable, but you can't rotate around it? Like, where is it for you?" And he went through some trial and error. I left it up to him. And he looked at me and he said, "When I'm at 1 o'clock, I'm really in a good position. I feel it. So anyways, make a long story short, we were talking the other day about it. And he said, the Dodgers are really good about, not talking mechanics with us or doing anything like that. They let us talk about it. And the only cue that Mark Pryor is allowed to say to me in the bullpen is, 'Hey, Walker, you're landing a little bit open at noon. You need to get your toes back at 1 o'clock.' It's the only cue. That wasn't drummed up in a fancy drill session written on a piece of paper. That was an experience that took place between a player and a coach that stuck with the player. But the player really, really is the one that created it. The suggestion was made by me, but he's the one that took it to another level. And a lot of times when we go through these things, we notice stuff inside a delivery, and we set up a drill. And like Lance talked about, these drills become very easy to perform. And I have a huge guinea pig right now. I got an 11-year-old son that wants to do anything and everything. And I've taken him through a bunch of stuff. And, just trying to tinker with it. And it keeps me occupied daily to get to the field. And I get to spend a lot of time with him. But he said to me about 3 weeks ago, he said, I want to throw a curveball, Dad. And I said, "Sure." He said, "Are you going to teach me?" I said, "I'll teach you how to hold it, but I'm not going to teach you how to throw it. You're going to have to teach yourself how to throw it." And he said, "Come on. Jake Eater told me that, like, do this, and Hugh Fisher, a couple left-handed pitchers. It's great." I said, "Do you know what you're doing?" He said, "No, but I'll figure it out." I said, "Okay, let's throw some curveballs." It was terrible. It was awful. I didn't say a word. We were playing catch. I said, "No, curveball's not there today, I guess." And then you fast forward like 2 weeks, we're in the backyard, and he wants to have a one-on-one old school wiffle ball tournament against me. Well, he comes out throwing a snapdragon. on left, and I'm going, what is going on here? So at the back of my brain, I said, okay. So the next time we played catch, it was time to throw the curveball again. I looked at him and I said, why don't you just throw your curveball like you throw the wiffle ball curveball? Because that was pretty good the other day. And it registered inside his head, and all of a sudden now you got proper spin on a curveball from an 11-year-old kid with no cues involved. He figured it out, no teaching. And I think what happens a lot of times is we feel the need as a coach that we always need to be teaching them something. We always. And as a private instructor, I get it. They're coming to you to learn, and they're coming to you, and you got to have, a lesson plan so-called put together for them. But you can just create the environment. If you create the environment right, and you get the drills set up that you think it's going to accomplish what this person needs to accomplish on a given night or a given week, you can accomplish a lot without even saying much. And I think a lot of times what happens is we want to let them know how much we really know and how much we care about them getting better. And we get in the way a lot. Sometimes the best coaching is just get out of the way. And, I think just listening to a lot of people over the last couple of weeks, we've learned a lot of information. And it just seems to be a real commonality is that, the best coaches in this industry, in this business, they have really good people skills. They know how to manage people, and they pay attention to what the person's feeling, what the pitcher's feeling. They ask the right questions, and ultimately they find out who can perform in the arena and who can't. And if they can't perform in the arena right now, there's a constant pursuit in their mind to figure out how am I going to get this young man to perform in the arena. And that's kind of like what Steve talked about sending guys to junior college. It's kind of like the amateur golfer getting to the tee box on, hole number 1 every day, and he shanks his drive because of the anxiety. Yet at the driving range, he was straight down the runway all day. And then by hole 3, he's pretty good. Those are the anxieties that, you have to overcome. And to really think about that stuff, that takes daily energy. There's no just magic wand, magic button to that. You just have to really, really stay on it and constant pursuit of figuring out how can this happen. And you just keep hammering it like a daily vitamin. And eventually, there's no parameters on a race. And that's the real challenge with today's game is everyone wants things instantaneously. The development, the evolution of a pitcher. I mean, to take a look at it. Garrett Cole's the best pitcher in the game right now, in some people's opinions. And if you look back at him at his days at UCLA, that looked like a baby deer on the mound. You look back at him as senior year of high school, it was even worse, from a mechanical movement standpoint. But boy, you got a real finished product right now that's really starting to figure things out. That took 10 to 12 years of evolution. So there's no time frame on a race. And I think as young athletes, we want to put a lot of time on a race, and they want things to happen really fast. And if it's not going to happen there, they take off, and they put a lot of expectations, pressures on themselves. So your job as a coach is to really just constantly hammer the daily growth for them. Just constantly hammer it. Give them the recipe to help them solve it. Give them the clues to solve the mystery, as I always say. But it takes just some creativity. It takes an adaptation of drills. You see things, you learn from other players' experiences, and you just try to apply it to your players, your pitchers, your facility as best you can. That's just my personal belief on it. And, you could say, I get that question, Lance gets all the time. What are your 3 favorite drills of the core velocity? Whoa, I do a lot of different things, and none of them are the same, so each guy's at a different level. It's a development level. So to answer those questions are hard, from that realm. But, hopefully that's some thoughts and some insight on the core velocity belt. And, I'd love it if there's any questions or anything, feel free to hit them out. Let's go.
You touched on 2 points that I thought was really cool. One was finding that connection that you said that he could throw the wiffle ball and then the baseball. So taking that connection, something off the field, and being able to apply it, man, I think that's huge. And I think there's a lot of nuggets that people can uncover just by simply asking stuff like that. I thought that was really
yeah, that was cool. That was cool, Lance. That was like a really interesting deal. And, I didn't want to cue it up, and I do believe I've talked to all the guys that have really good breaking balls, Sonny Gray and Kyle Wright and Walker Buehler and those guys I've coached. I said, when did you start throwing the curveball? They're like 10 years old, 11 years old. And I just, everyone thinks you shouldn't do it. And I just said, well, those guys spin the ball better than anybody that I know. So if they spun it and they're spinning it, let's see if he can spin it a little bit. But I'm not going to cue it up because, the old cues, they lead to a lot of misunderstanding, like, pull it down like a lampshade. Get your fingers to the front. I just wanted him to figure it out. And I think a lot of times that's where, it's a beautiful thing when they do, because now it's ingrained in him. He's going to be able to go back to that feel. Whether he turns out to be a good player or not, I don't know. I mean, we don't know, but he can spin the ball a little bit right now.
And he's going to enjoy it because he's not being coached. He's had the freedom. So now there is that belief and that confidence that grows from just that there. But, man, like I've said this, and I'm not just blowing your head up, but you're one of the best I've ever seen. Ogden's one of the best I've ever seen, Steve Smith. But Fred Corral was one of the first guys. I remember one of the first things he ever told me, and it stuck with me since, is your job as a coach, your responsibility as a coach is to eliminate your job as a coach. And, man, that just really stuck with me. But I think that's wise, because you're right on. I think too often we think that we're supposed to coach them up. And a lot of times just coaching them up is just self-guided discovery, man. Controlling the environment and just leading them to the path to water. Like you said, that's brilliant. So I'll open it up to anything else.
And you just think about too, is like, I'm not a professional baseball, but I hear these stories all the time. And, the Dominican players, and the freedom that they have on that island of throwing that baseball. And it looks like they're playing Frisbee and screwing around in the backyard, flipping balls with ease. And, they get into an organization and they get structured, and it takes the freedom of catch play out of them. And you see them just falter, they get injured, things happen. And you're wondering, being an athlete is having the ability to go slow, go fast, field, make short throws, make quick throws, make long throws, pitch on the mound, make adjustments quickly. And when you're in a constant structure of catch play, over and over, and you're doing the same monotonous work all the time, and you feel like there's no way that feel and adjustability are going to be creative, And one of the things that I really look for, Ogden mentioned, is two-way guys and playing other sports. If I recruit a shortstop that becomes, as a pitcher here at Vanderbilt, and he's a two-way guy in high school, and he can't play shortstop for us at our level because maybe the bat's behind, that young man takes ground balls 2 to 3 times a week and throws them across the diamond. He's not just a PO to me. He's an athlete. And, the only reason he's not playing a position for us is because he can't hit. And, but he's defensively pretty good. But it's part of his throwing program. It's his training. It's his ability to have some adjustability. And it's fun. It's fun. It's a fun catch play on some days, So, those are things that I think sometimes as we get, more and more information, we lose track of that little league kid, and really, putting them in a really good place to be successful. There's great training measures out there, and you can, as they certainly climb in development levels, you can start to add things, and they'll have a better understanding of things. It's really good. And I know this guy pretty well, is Mason Hickman, and just talking about Mason Hickman with the ground force mound they have, this is very interesting. And I think I'll share this with you, experience too, is I thought at the beginning of the year, I thought Mason was a little bit open, as he with his center down the mound. And I was working on a holding runners drill with him at second base. And I noticed that when he was really working on starting his delivery with his eyes on second base as one of our techniques, his alignment to the plate was way better. I didn't say a word. I didn't tell him to do anything. And I noticed that the ballistic data was coming back better.
Yeah.
The velocity was up 2 miles an hour. And so I just made a mental note of it, and I started to look at it on a ground force mound, and I noticed that his center mass was moving open. Not by much, 3 inches or so, but it shows you on the ground force the angle the center mass moves down the slope. So I was able to see that a little bit. And I kind of just mentioned to him, I didn't want to say, anything in particular, but I thought, hey, I think you really got to pay attention to, on your film, just pay attention to your alignment a little bit. Just make sure you're not getting a little bit open, And he started working on actually, letting his arm unwind a little bit better. And as he was working on letting his arm unwind in his lead up work, staying in tighter constraints with his lower half and just really torquing his center and being like a tornado in a doorway, he started to move his alignment more closed without even any cues or anything, just by natural lead up work of him trying to feel something inside his arm path. And unfortunately, his last start against Hawaii, he was really good. He was up to 93, which Mason's, he's been 88 to 90, but he sat 92, 93. It was one of the best outings I'd seen out of him in a long time. And I started to pay attention to his ground force. I went back and looked at it. And with each consecutive ground force, because all I was doing was collecting data at this particular time, his center mass started to close up more and more and more. And I just thought that was extremely interesting, from that point of view, is, just a little bit off kilter with the center mass just caused him a couple miles an hour and also caused him to cut the baseball at times, unintentionally.
Yeah.
So it created that little bit of, opening that just threw his timing off. And you wouldn't say anything because the performance was always good. Mason's always performed. And you're thinking, this guy. So just paying attention to little details when you see something, and by changing the environment and paying attention to that particular rep can lead you down a path that you say, whoa, something maybe a little bit, there's still maybe a little bit more efficiency inside this guy. And, now with the technology you have in this day and age, you can certainly go and justify your thoughts and beliefs. And at the bare minimum, I probably know 1/8 of this ground force amount of what I need to know or will know eventually, I hope. But it gets my point across. And if I get my point across to the player, I don't really care, so that's the important piece.
That's right. I love that. I love it. And two, like what I've always seen, man, like with most of the big problems we're always trying to tackle, if you really trace it back, it's always something so small that shows up as the biggest problem. And when you start to look at it backwards like that to the smallest problem, those are usually the easiest ones to fix too.
Hey, Brownie, if you've got a shortstop who can't hit, I'll take him.
Smitty, jeez. No, the guy can pitch. He can pitch, Smitty. So sorry.
I'll take him. I'll take that for too. But if he wants to hit again,
we won't go to Zoom call, Scott.
Well,
so I think what Brownie was just talking about is great evidence of how you're really not working just arm action or just pelvic control or whatever. Like, it's all connected. You're likely to see a arm constraint drill actually improve or optimize pelvic control or stride direction, and that's why it's important to number one, make sure you're measuring the data to then be able to ask better questions and use it for feedback, etc. But also making sure that you're not just assuming that they're interdependent. Again, it's kind of like the data in human nature. It's just like the arm spiral and the pelvis. All of it is working together, and can certainly influence the other.
Hey, Rick, tell them I'll be right back.
Does anybody have any, really, really good experiences, inside a player that, you thought was just a cool experience that, you could share, if you're working on something, inside the delivery, mentally, anything. I mean, because I just think when you hear a player's experience and a coach talk about it, it relates to somebody It just does. And, I think if anybody has that, it'd be great to hear.
I'll give one real quick on setup. And I think some guys have mentioned this before. I was banging my head against the wall with a particular guy a couple of years ago about, the heel sliding in. And I think we've always looked at that as when it's happening is what's important. On the way down is a righty's right heel sliding in, his attempt to screw in the ground and optimize that, or is it because he's swinging the leg up and tapping into the quad, etc. But the point is the guy's heel just kept creeping further and further away from the rubber, and I'm coaching him traditionally, and that we want to be neutral with the rubber, and totally guilty of that for sure. And I finally asked him, like, why do you think that's happening? And he's like, man, it just feels better, like I feel like I'm really loading, or whatever his words were. And instead of fighting him on it, I've been just like, hell with it, man. Slide your heel off the rubber. And then it turns out, whether it was that year or the next, I don't remember, but Tressler speaking at Palooza, and he's talking about arch type and how it relates to the pelvis and hip orientation, and how that's so crucial in determining ranges of motion and how guys are going to externally, internally rotate. And what I found was that his arch type directly correlated with his inability to externally rotate, and that was how he was finding a way to do it instinctively. And so if I continue to just pound that home, that no, man, you get your foot back in neutral, you want to square with the rubber, then I'm probably sending that guy down the wrong path. And he goes on to have a pretty good career, and the rest is history. But I think that's a great example of number one, making sure that you're listening to what they're saying, asking questions, how does that feel, but also understanding a little bit of the anatomy and how some of that is real. and we can influence a guy's delivery just by putting him in a better setup. And that's the lowest hanging fruit, right?
If guys that aren't familiar with this, like what he's talking about with the foot type, and this is an easy way to do it, is that how the hips and the hips and the feet are highly integrated. They're very interconnected. So guys with flat feet, the only guy that I would ever set up in line with the rubber would be a guy with a high arch. As the foot gets flatter, you're going to take the heel and you're going to move it away. So there's no right or wrong way. Again, it's like James saying, it's testing it. But an easy way to test this is get them out on concrete, pour a bottle of water, have them step into it barefooted, and then have them step onto the concrete. If you see no middle arch whatsoever or very little, consider that a high arch. So start them normal. The flatter the foot, the mid-arch, the flatter the foot, start to peel their heel away. So it's just like we're doing a deadlift. Because what you will see a lot of times, guys that can't corkscrew their hips or slightly externally rotate their hips to where their kneecap comes out is because of their foot type. So if a guy's struggling with that, take their toes and point them outward. The flatter the foot, the more outward they're going to be pointed. And you're going to start to see how that allows the hip to function a little bit more efficiently. So that's an easy test too, is just to pour water, test the foot type, and then making sure that every time they perform an activity that the quality is right, their setup is right, that everything matters, because a lot of times guys will just go through that and then they go right back to what they're doing. So again, everything you said on the mound is a direct result of what's happening off the mound. So the quality of the practice, their setup really, really matters. Good point.
How about for a hitter, that same move,
I would see I'm not a hitting coach, but I would see, if you're talking about how the hips function efficiently, it would have to be the same, in my opinion.
Yeah, easy one with that is watch them hit, and then have them do it when they hit. You'll know right away. But I would say for sure that the same body, same movement.
One of my best analogies I've ever heard for a lower half, and man, he's right on, Scott Brown. Remember when you were talking about it's like being in the cold and you're pushing a car out of the snow, like you've got to have ground force. You've got to be in a good position to be able to drive into the ground and project that car, because if you're relying on how most guys are set up pitching and trying to push it, man, you're going to chip a tube. Like something bad is going wrong. But I love that analogy. That just made sense to me.
That makes a whole lot of sense, and that's the first time I heard that. That's awesome.
Yeah, because you have to be in place. You have to have the foot directly applied directly into the ground. As you know, being short, man, or it's just not happening. So I love that one.
So you're saying that pushing from the toes with excessive pelvic separation is not a good idea, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it could end up chipping a tooth in the ice. So, yeah, it matters. Yep. Any other thoughts? Any other questions?
I got something along what Brownie was talking about, just kind of a personal experience. And Lance, you know this guy that we actually had him thrown at a plyo box to kind of doing some stuff, and I can let Lance kind of tell some of that story. But you know, this kid wanted it so bad, and he had a good arm, and you know, there were some, and I tried and it kind of got to the point you kind of knew it was between his ears. And as a coach, it was to the point of me wanting to have to say something, but I just wanted to help him. And the best thing that I could do was finally let him fail and hit rock bottom. And when he hit rock bottom, that was where he kind of found his, hey, I got to do this. And then when you realize that, when the player realizes that they're the one that's got to do it, because I'm in the dugout when he's making that pitch, and then I could help him. When he realizes he's the one that's got to do it, that was when I could help. But if I was sitting there trying to do it, and that was a good moment for me, as far as doing that, because, you know, it's easy to share the success stories, and, you know, when we say that, but man, there's a lot of times where guys, you know, we have 6 to 8 guys that pitch for us, but most of us have between 14 and 20 on the staff, and those guys matter too, man. And you got to let those guys fail. And it goes back to talking about what you were saying about the growth process, the success. It's not always during the season for them. And so I just want to kind of share that with you guys. Man, the best thing for him was to let him fail. That's hard to say.
Yeah. There's no doubt about it, man. And some of the best lessons that I've learned is how I feel like writing a Dear John apology letter to half the players I've coached because some of the stuff that I've done. But yeah, learning from and two, like the change is never going to happen unless they want to have change, unless they see a reason. They're just not going to be very accepting to it too. So anytime a guy fails, it also puts them in a better position for you guys to build that relationship and try new stuff because they're willing to try it at that point. But that's really good stuff. That's the guy that was just kind of overthinking mechanics and
he was doing everything. He was changing his arm slot, and he, the funny thing was, so the story was, Lance got him to get a plyo box, and hey man, try to break it like that. So he gave him just this one external thing he was going to try to do. Well, he was throwing it, and he noticed his velocity was down, and you go, well, hey man, why don't you feel like you can't hit the plyo box? I mean, why don't you feel like you can't break the plyo box? And he's like, well, I'm not throwing hard enough. And I'm sitting there going, you dumbass, you're not hitting it, first of all. Like, it doesn't matter how hard you're throwing until you hit it. But he had to realize that first, but he couldn't see you're not going to break it unless you hit it. And so it didn't matter. That was what I'm not throwing hard enough. I'm not throwing hard enough. And so, but no, he had to find out the answer for himself. And that was a great lesson for me, just to kind of get the hell out the way a little bit.
I think I'd build on that too. I've seen situations, I think we've all had this, where guys, the expectations that they have to navigate, especially if a lot of it's external, right? If they don't own the expectations, it could be a big scholarship, it could be, pro interest, it could be parents, it could be whatever they have, that sometimes with those guys, they've got to fail to the point where those expectations are almost stripped away, and he has the chance to start to rebuild his own ownership of expectation as he regains his confidence. And I think it's an awesome opportunity as a coach to help a guy come back. So I think when they're going down, it's really difficult to help them because they don't really own those expectations, right? They're trying to do what they think other people think they should be doing. And one of the fascinating things I've seen in some of the most really successful pitchers that I've ever coached were walk-on guys, low money walk-on guys that when they came in, the expectations weren't much externally, and from within their own ownership of it, they were just looking like, hey, I just hope I get inter-squad innings, right? And then, oh man, I hope I just get a chance to travel. I hope I get it, and so it's a pretty basic expectation. I think a lot of times you see guys that navigate that management, that expectation management as a coach that you have to do, can sometimes be really critical at how guys, succeed, fail, or handle the failures they run into.
Man, that's genius. You're so right on, Rob. I've never really thought about it that way, but I can honestly say this. The biggest scholarships I ever gave in college baseball was never, ever to the best player. It wasn't. It was always the lower dollar guys. But when you say it like that, as far as setting the expectations, I mean, that makes perfect sense, man. That's good. That's really good.
Well, some of it too, it's going back to what you're talking about with your skateboard thing, right? I mean, when you're doing it on your own or with your kid, it's just kind of you trying to figure it out and have a good time with it. But the minute you got in front of some dudes that really knew what they were doing, now you're trying to live up to their expectations of what a guy can do, and it can be paralyzing, man. Some guys just can't. They struggle with that.
And you know what, too? That goes back to like the skateboarding culture always really fascinated me, man. Because here's something that they do differently. Number one is they'll do a trick. It's like they throw it into the bowl, and then the other people will take that trick and they'll add to it, and they bring a different trick to the table. And everybody in the skateboarding language knows the name of that trick. There's a common language for everybody. You ask anybody what a kickflip is, and everybody there knows what it is. You ask a pitcher what stay back means, and you're going to get 20 different answers. What stays back? When does it stay back? But the problem is everybody will raise their hand as if they knew the right answer. I am staying back. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. So it runs into that. But another thing cool with skateboarding is too, man, you think about like when you're learning a trick, there's a different sound to it. There's so much sensory feedback. But in skating, the culture is that it's not about if you make the trip. They're smacking the boards and cheering and celebrating because you tried it. So pretty soon they're rewarding you for the risk you take until you do it long enough that pretty soon the reward is the actual risk of the trick. And that's kind of how X-born skaters are born, because they're continuously pushing the limit, because they eliminate that fear of failure because they're celebrating for failing, or at least having the nuts to try it. So I think that's always been cool about the skateboarding culture and kind of what we could learn from that, man. And two, skateboarding is, they celebrate individual style, man. If you got a weak style, you're not very good. Or if you're, so they really celebrate individuality, rather than kind of what we do with pitching, is that we think they're supposed to look a certain way, to where skateboarding celebrating looking the opposite of everybody else. So I thought that was cool too.
I think that's a great point. And Brownie, chime in if you remember this conversation, but there was a few years ago, we were just kind of joking around, but it was like, instead of having the fall season, the traditional fall season in baseball, college baseball, like, what would happen if every Sunday both of our teams showed up at random city park and they just played? No coaches, no nothing. They just went out there and played the game. You know, like, pick teams, do your thing. What kind of environment would that look like versus our traditional inter squad scrimmages, where speaking to the skateboarding analogy, where like there's just not a lot of freedom, and there's not a lot of real competition with anxiousness, guys having agendas, and coaches getting in the way. You know, I think that's a dream scenario, but it certainly makes me think of that for sure.
We may be getting close to finding that out.
Yeah,
it might be a good thing.
You're right. You're right.
Just open the parks up, you know.
You know, I think one of the big things that we look at when you're just talking about that, James, is that, you know, you think about fall ball and fall baseball. Every day the players show up and they're in the lineup. They're playing. They're getting their work in every single day. I mean, there's, you know, if you're scrimmaging, almost everybody's getting their at-bats and everything's fine. And then when you go to the preseason in our sport too, the same thing happens, because we have to play two teams against each other, and your pitchers all get the same amount of work, and you start putting them into roles. And what you find out is once game one's played and the lineup goes up, you really find out like who is committed, who can handle this, because only 9 guys are going to play, you know, on that first given day. And you know, when you get to a point where you get 6 to, you know, I think John Savage said this the best about pitching. He's like, you know, if you got a really, really good pitching staff, you got 8 pitchers. You know, if you got a good pitching staff, you got 10. If you got just an okay pitching staff, you got 12. You know, so you start thinking about it, it's like if you got a really good pitching staff, you're only pitching 6 to 8 guys. And it's a beautiful thing when you start thinking about it. But what happens to the other 10 guys that aren't pitching for you, that, you know, all of a sudden they went from getting, you know, all their touches to getting all their work. Now they're showing up and they just have to pull for the team. And you really find out at that particular time who has it inside them to really work and take advantage of an opportunity when they get it, because that to me is what I've seen. And the challenge is for some guys is they get that one opportunity, whether, you know, you got in a game that's a little lopsided and you get them in there. And some of them view it as, this is my only chance, my last chance, and I got to get it done. Otherwise I'm never going to pitch again. And that happens, and it's real. And I think when you identify with those things, you know, it's amazing, because you try to help guys through that. But, you know, to get back to your point, like, I would just love to see how our players operated, you know, walking over to Lipscomb. Maybe they would brawl. I don't know. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they just walk out to home plate and say, listen, you know, who knows what would happen. But, like, you know, it would just be such an interesting old school dynamic of, like, I bet you we find out about some guys that we don't know things about. It's kind of like your question, Steve, you know. What do I not know about you? You might find out a guy might act a little differently in that environment. So it would be interesting.
I think that's a really interesting point, James, because I mean, some of the best observations I've ever made of our players, and whether it's about them or about even what teaches we've given them, is either on off days or like optional workout days where they don't have to do it, they don't have to be there, but what are they doing when they are there, right? And a lot of times we talk about even things like with the core velocity belt or any other tools that we have, that's when my eyes are wide open. It's like, all right, what are you doing when I'm not making you do it? What do you gravitate to, right? And the same thing when you're talking about even pitchers. Sometimes guys will come in and throw a side on their own on an off day because they want to get a little more work. What does that sort of look like when you can watch it from 100 yards away and not right on top of them, where they know you're kind of dictating the environment? you can see some differences. I mean, we noticed that this is not a pitching thing; it was a shortstop thing. But we had an infielder that, like, during team D and team related drills, man, the kid just struggled. He threw the ball away. He just didn't handle it very well. But then after practice, we're all done or whatever, and he'd have, one of the managers start hitting balls to him or one of his teammates, and he's friggin' loose and he's flowing and he's just going, right? Because now all of a sudden the environment's changed and his brain's changed and the whole thing's different, right? And so I think that stuff's really fascinating when you can observe them in these less structured environments, and sometimes you can learn some really important cues on how to coach them back in a game or a more structured environment to try to get them to be more productive.
Man, that's genius. And too, I think that goes to show, because I had a rule, like what I would always do at the beginning of each school year is I would put guys together and I would act like I had compliance meetings, and I would go up in the office and I would watch. And what I found, guys that liked to throw found other guys that liked to throw. Guys that didn't like to throw, they always matched up. They always knew. They always found each other. But I think that goes back to showing, like, the power we have as coaches. One thing we can control is the environment by creating, whether it's that game or structuring the environment differently. They're always going to adapt to the imposed demand. So it's really about balancing those imposed demands to see the result that we actually get and what we're looking for. But I'm 100% with all you guys on that, man. I think that's genius.
I think there will be some brawls, but they will hopefully be with guys on the same team and pitching changes. Like that's where you'd want to see the fucking punches thrown. Like, no, man, you don't get the ball. Like, no, man, you're out. That you'd find out where they stood amongst the tribe.
Yeah, well, the lineup will tell you that too.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you guys are making the lineup. So it'd be cool, but yeah, like Steve said, man. Hopefully we can see that before this thing is over, but I doubt it.
Is there anything else you guys would like to touch on? Because I know we've been here a while, and Rex is up here, and I think he's getting ready to go. But my man can stay here several hours later if there's more stuff that we want to talk about. Any other questions? Anybody that's been quiet that would like to share something? Well, we'll end it there. But, man, I can't tell you guys thanks enough. And one last thing, I just saw Mike Knoll on here. I didn't see Mike on there earlier, but Mike's another guy, man. I couldn't do it without him. Like, he's a big part of this, and he's not the guy that's always looking for attention, just like John. They'll stay behind the scenes. But, man, we couldn't do stuff like this without either one of those guys, and they just make my life so much easier, and I just can't thank those guys enough. So I'm going to make sure and recognize those guys. But if there's anything else, man, let's shoot it. If not, shoot me a question. Or if you have questions, please let me know, man. Reach out to me. You guys have my email. You guys have my phone number. If I can help in any way, let me know. But thank you guys for showing up. Always great to get guys like this together and talk shop, man. And we'll do it again here sometime soon, too.
Thank you, Lance. Yep, thanks, Lance.
See you guys.
Thanks, Lance.
Thanks, Lance. Awesome stuff.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Good to see you.